let me ask you something that's been weighing on me more and more each quarter. If you knew a storm was coming, if you could see it forming on the radar, would you wait until the rain was hitting your face to start building shelter? Of course not. Nobody would. And yet that's exactly what most of us do with the economy. We wait until we feel the pain in our own lives, until we see the headlines screaming about crisis, until it's already too late to adjust. And right now, I believe there's a storm forming on the radar, not a hurricane that's going to make landfall tomorrow, but a slow building system that has the potential to become something much more dangerous than most people realize. The question isn't whether it will arrive. The question is whether you'll be ready when it does. I've spent 40 years in banking. I've sat in the room during crashes, panics, bailouts, and recoveries. And if there's one thing that experience teaches you, it's that the biggest threats are never the ones everyone's talking about. They're the ones building quietly beneath the surface while everyone focuses on the news of the day. In 2006, nobody was talking about subprime mortgage derivatives at dinner parties. They were talking about how much money they were making in real estate. In 1999, nobody was warning about the dot-com bubble bursting. They were explaining why the old valuation rules no longer applied. The danger is never most visible when it's most real. It's most visible right before it breaks, when it's already too late for most people to do anything about it. So today I want to talk about what I see as the single biggest economic threat facing us right now. Not the only threat, but the one that concerns me most. The one that combines multiple risks into something larger than the sum of its parts. And I want to be crystal clear from the start. I'm not here to scare you. I'm not here to predict doom. I'm here to give you the same lens I use every day as CEO of this institution, so you can see what I see and make your own decisions accordingly. Because the people who get hurt worst in economic downturns aren't the ones who saw it coming and prepared. They're the ones who refuse to look. If you want to be in the first group instead of the second, if you want to understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines, take a moment right now to hit subscribe. Your future self will thank you for having the courage to look at the radar instead of just feeling the rain. The threat I'm talking about is a triangle. Three forces that are each dangerous on their own, but together create something much more volatile. The first corner of that triangle is government debt. The second is persistent inflation. And the third is geopolitical fragmentation. Each one feeds the others. Each one makes the others harder to solve. And together, they're creating an environment where the next economic shock, whenever it comes, will be harder to manage than anything we've faced in decades. Let's start with debt, because this is the foundation that everything else rests on. The United States has accumulated enormous levels of government debt over the past 15 years. And look, I want to be fair about this. During the financial crisis, government spending helped prevent a complete collapse. During the pandemic, it kept millions of families and businesses afloat. There were times when borrowing was not just justified, but necessary. I supported much of it myself. But here's what worries me now. We've gotten comfortable with debt. We've normalized it. We've stopped treating it as an emergency measure and started treating it as a permanent way of life. And debt, any debt, cannot grow faster than the economy forever without consequences. That's not politics. That's arithmetic. When I was a young banker, much younger than most of you, I watched a very successful investor lose everything because he forgot this arithmetic. He kept saying, people have been predicting a crash for years and it hasn't happened, so I'm going to keep taking more risk. And he did. Right up until the crash that finally did happen, he didn't see it coming because he had trained himself to ignore warnings. He had convinced himself that because the predictions were early, they were wrong. And when the cycle finally turned, he had no margin of safety left, no cushion, no plan B. He was so busy proving the pessimists wrong that he forgot to protect himself if they ever turned out to be right. I never forgot that lesson. Not because he was stupid, he wasn't, but because he was human. And humans have a powerful psychological bias toward assuming the present will continue. We project the recent past into the distant future. We convince ourselves that this time the old rules don't apply. And that bias, that normalcy bias, is exactly what makes the eventual adjustment so painful for so many people. If you're a family watching this, you understand this intuitively. If your household income is $100,000 and your mortgage payment is $2,000 a month, that's manageable. But if you keep borrowing, if you keep adding car payments and credit card balances and personal loans, eventually the payments consume more and more of your income. You have less flexibility, less margin for error, less ability to handle an unexpected expense or a temporary disruption. The exact same thing happens to countries, just on a much larger scale. Higher debt means higher borrowing costs, It means more of every tax dollar goes to interest payments instead of roads or schools or research. It means when the next crisis hits, when we actually need to borrow more to stabilize the economy, our options will be far more limited because we've already used so much of our capacity. Now here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. What happens when the cost of servicing that debt becomes the largest line item in the federal budget? What happens when investors start demanding higher returns to compensate for the risk of lending to a country that's already deeply in debt? We saw a preview of this a few years ago in the UK bond market when a relatively modest policy announcement triggered a cascade of selling that forced the Bank of England to intervene. That wasn't a crisis in the United States, but it was a warning. It was a demonstration of how quickly confidence can evaporate and how violent the adjustment can be when it does. And that was before we added the second corner of our triangle. That was before inflation changed the entire calculation. And that question, what happens when confidence evaporates and debt service becomes unsustainable, that brings us directly to the second corner of our triangle. Because inflation changes everything about how debt behaves. When prices rise, it erodes the value of money. That sounds like it might help with debt because you're paying back dollars that are worth less than the ones you borrowed. And in some ways that's true. Governments have been tempted throughout history to inflate their way out of debt problems. But here's what they always discover. Inflation is like borrowing energy from a fire. It feels warm at first, but it can burn your whole house down if you lose control of it. Inflation forces central banks to raise interest rates to cool the economy down. And higher interest rates make debt more expensive to service, both for the government and for every business and family that carries variable rate debt. So you get this vicious cycle. High debt makes the economy more sensitive to rates. Inflation forces rates higher. Higher rates make debt more painful, and everyone feels it. I've now been CEO of JP Morgan Chase for nearly 2 decades, and I can tell you that the single biggest variable we watch in times like these isn't any single policy or headline. It's the feedback loop between debt and inflation. Because once that loop gets going, once it becomes self-reinforcing, it's extraordinarily difficult to break. Think about what happened in the 1970s. Inflation became embedded in everything. Wage contracts included automatic cost of living adjustments. Businesses assumed prices would keep rising and set their strategies accordingly. Consumers accelerated their purchases because they knew things would be more expensive next month. Inflation stopped being a temporary phenomenon and became a permanent expectation. And breaking that expectation required interest rates so high that they triggered back-to-back recessions and unemployment above 10%. The cure was almost as painful as the disease. That's the danger when inflation gets entrenched. The medicine required to stop it is brutal, and the longer you wait, the stronger the medicine has to be. But inflation isn't just about interest rates and central bank policy, it's about behavior. It seeps into every decision people make. When prices are rising faster than wages, which has been the reality for millions of Americans over the past few years, people feel it in their bones. They feel like they're working harder and falling further behind. They become more cynical about the future. They pull back on long-term planning because the short term feels so uncertain. And that caution, that psychological withdrawal, becomes its own economic drag. Businesses see consumers pulling back and delay investment. Workers see opportunities shrinking and become less willing to take risks. The whole system slows down, not because of any single policy or event, but because millions of individual people have quietly lost confidence. I remember sitting in meetings during the 2008 crisis, watching something similar happen. It wasn't the bad mortgages that broke the system. It was the loss of confidence in the institutions that held them. It was the sudden realization that nobody knew who was holding the risk, so nobody wanted to lend to anyone. The entire financial system seized up, not because of a lack of dollars, but because of a lack of trust. And trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. The same dynamic applies to inflation. When people lose confidence that their money will hold its value, when they start to doubt that the central bank can control prices, that doubt becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They demand higher wages. Businesses raise prices to cover those wages. The spiral continues. Now, here's what most people miss. Inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. It's not a rising tide that lifts all boats. It's more like a regressive tax that punishes the people with the least ability to protect themselves. If you own assets that rise with inflation, if you have fixed rate debt that gets paid back in cheaper dollars, you might actually benefit. But if you live paycheck to paycheck, if your savings are in cash, if your wages lag behind price increases, inflation quietly destroys your standard of living. I've seen this pattern repeat across decades and across countries. The wealthy complain about inflation, the poor are devastated by it, and the middle class gets squeezed until they can't breathe. So we have high debt that limits our ability to respond. We have persistent inflation that complicates every policy decision and punishes the most vulnerable. And now we have to ask ourselves, what happens when a third force enters this equation? What happens when the stable global order that kept prices predictable and capital flowing freely begins to fracture? Because that's exactly what we're seeing right now. Trade relationships that felt permanent are being reconsidered. Supply chains built over decades are being ripped apart and rebuilt. Alliances that defined the post-war era are being tested. And this isn't a temporary disruption. This is a structural shift that will take years, maybe decades, to play out. The third corner of our triangle is geopolitical fragmentation, and it's the one most people don't think about when they're checking their 401k or paying their mortgage. But they should, because when major powers impose new trade restrictions, when critical shipping lanes become contested, when alliances shift, it introduces new uncertainty into the global economic system. And uncertainty, as any business leader will tell you, is the enemy of investment. When you don't know what the rules will be next year, you don't expand, you don't hire, you wait. And that waiting, that collective hesitation, becomes its own economic contraction. Think about energy markets for a moment. We've seen what happens when geopolitical tensions disrupt oil and gas supplies. Prices spike, inflation accelerates. Central banks face impossible choices between fighting inflation and protecting growth. Now imagine that dynamic playing out across multiple fronts simultaneously. Food prices, semiconductor supply chains, critical minerals for batteries and electronics, capital flows between major economies. Each disruption on its own might be manageable, but when they start to compound, when they reinforce each other, the system becomes far more fragile than anyone realizes. This is where the three corners of the triangle meet. High debt means we have less room to respond to problems. Persistent inflation means the tools we do have are harder to use. Geopolitical fragmentation means new problems are constantly emerging that will test our ability to respond. It's like a fire department that's already used most of its water on previous fires. The hydrants are running at lower pressure, and someone keeps lighting new fires in different parts of the city. You don't need a perfect storm to overwhelm that department. You just need a few fires burning at the same time. You don't need a perfect storm to overwhelm that department. You just need a few fires burning at the same time. And that's exactly what geopolitical fragmentation is delivering. The world is reorganizing itself in real time, and most people are still operating under assumptions that no longer hold. Supply chains that were built over decades for maximum efficiency are being ripped apart and rebuilt for security. I've sat in boardrooms where companies are making decisions that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, moving production out of China not because it's cheaper, but because it's safer, paying more for materials from friendly countries, not because the quality is better, but because they can't afford the risk of being cut off. This is happening everywhere, across every industry, and it's creating persistent upward pressure on prices that has nothing to do with monetary policy. Trade relationships that felt permanent are being reconsidered. The United States and Europe are rethinking their dependence on Russian energy. The West is reevaluating its entire relationship with China. Emerging economies are deciding whether to align with competing power blocks or try to navigate a middle path. Every time a major country imposes new trade restrictions, every time a critical shipping lane becomes contested, every time alliances shift, it introduces new uncertainty into the global economic system. And uncertainty, as any business leader will tell you, is the enemy of investment. When you don't know what the rules will be next year, you don't expand, you don't hire, you wait, you hoard cash, you keep your options open. And that collective behavior, multiplied across millions of businesses and billions of consumers, slows the entire global economy. Conflicts between major powers are creating volatility in energy markets and food prices, in the flow of capital across borders. We saw what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. Wheat prices skyrocketed. Fertilizer costs soared. Countries that depend on imports for basic food supplies faced hunger and instability. Now imagine that dynamic playing out in other critical areas: semiconductors, rare earth minerals, pharmaceuticals. Each of these supply chains is concentrated in ways that make them vulnerable to disruption. Each of them touches every part of the modern economy, and each of them is now being viewed through the lens of national security rather than economic efficiency. This isn't a temporary thing. This is a structural shift that will take years, maybe decades, to play out. Put these three together and you have something much more dangerous than any single risk. High debt means we have less room to respond to problems. Persistent inflation means the tools we do have, like lowering interest rates, are harder to use because inflation is already too high. Geopolitical fragmentation means new problems are constantly emerging, from energy shocks to trade disruptions that will test our ability to respond. The fire department analogy is accurate, but let me give you a more personal one. Think about your own finances. If you have high credit card debt, your options are limited. If your expenses keep rising faster than your income, you're under constant pressure. If your job becomes less secure because your employer is navigating global uncertainty, you're living with anxiety every day. Now imagine all three happening at once. That's where we are as a country and as a global economy. Now I want to pause here because I can feel what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, this sounds like every other warning you've heard. You're thinking, people have been predicting disaster for years and it hasn't happened. You're thinking, maybe this time really is different. And I understand that skepticism, I really do, because you're right. People have been warning about debt and inflation and global instability for a long time, and the economy has kept growing, markets have kept rising, life has kept getting better for most people. But here's what I've learned in 40 years of watching economies and markets. The fact that a warning has been wrong in the past doesn't mean it will always be wrong. The fact that the storm hasn't hit yet doesn't mean the sky is permanently clear. It means the pressure is still building. So what does this mean for you? Not in some abstract policy sense, but in the reality of your own life. Because I can sit here all day describing problems, and that might be interesting, but it doesn't help anyone. The value isn't in diagnosing the illness. The value is in understanding what you can do while there's still time to act. And there is still time. That's the part people miss. Between the moment risks become visible and the moment they become unavoidable, there's a window. A window where the people who pay attention, who think clearly, who refuse to be complacent, can position themselves differently. That window is open right now. If I were sitting where you are, here's what I would focus on. First, I would stop trying to predict exactly what happens next. Nobody knows. Anyone who tells you they know is selling something. The goal isn't prediction, the goal is preparation. It's building a foundation strong enough to handle multiple possible futures, not just the one you hope will happen. Second, I would look at my own debt differently. Not all debt is bad, but all debt is risk. In an environment where rates are higher and more volatile, that risk is amplified. If you have variable rate debt, understand exactly what happens if rates go up another point. If you're carrying credit card balances, understand that those rates are already punishing and could become more so. The safest debt is the debt you don't take on in the first place. When I was young, I made the mistake of carrying too much debt because I assumed my rising income would cover it. It did eventually, but not without some sleepless nights I could have avoided. Learn from that. Don't borrow against a future that hasn't arrived yet. Third, I would think about liquidity. Cash in normal times feels like a drag. It earns nothing. It gets eaten by inflation. But in uncertain times, cash is oxygen. It's the ability to make decisions from strength rather than desperation. When markets drop, when credit tightens, when job losses mount, the people with cash don't panic. They don't have to sell at the worst possible time. They can wait. They can be patient. They can look at distressed assets and see opportunity instead of threat. That patience, that ability to wait is more valuable than most people realize. I've seen billionaires lose everything because they were illiquid when the margin calls came. And I've seen ordinary families survive crises because they had 6 months of expenses in the bank. Fourth, and most important, I would invest in my own adaptability. I would learn things that make me more valuable across different environments. I would build relationships with people who think differently than I do. I would stay curious about how the world is changing instead of clinging to how it used to be. Because in a rapidly changing economy, the most durable asset you own isn't your house or your portfolio. It's your ability to learn, to adapt, to figure things out. Those things don't get wiped out in a market crash. They don't get called by a lender. They become more valuable when everything else is uncertain. The goal isn't to live in fear. It's not to check your portfolio every hour or assume the worst is always coming. That's no way to live. The goal is to build something real, a foundation strong enough that when the ground shifts, and it will shift, you don't collapse. A margin of safety wide enough that when things go wrong, and they will go wrong, you have room to adjust. A mindset flexible enough that when the future doesn't look like you expected, and it never does, you can pivot instead of breaking. I've now been CEO of JP Morgan Chase for nearly 2 decades. I've seen booms and busts, crises and recoveries, moments of irrational exuberance and periods of unjustified despair. And if there's one thing I've learned that I hope stays with you long after this conversation, it's this. Economic strength isn't about never facing difficulty. It's about having the capacity to absorb difficulty and keep moving forward. That's true for countries. It's true for companies. And it's absolutely true for individuals. So don't be the person who assumes the music will keep playing forever. Don't be the person who ignores the pressure building beneath the surface because it's easier to focus on today. Be the person who pays attention, who asks the hard questions, who builds a foundation strong enough for whatever comes next. Not because you're pessimistic, but because you're responsible. Not because you expect disaster, but because you respect reality. The economy will have its challenges. It always has. It always will.